Thank you everyone for coming along today. There was a lot of good sessions on, so I appreciate you coming along to my one. My name's Jonathan Giles. I'm the UI Controls Technical Lead at Oracle, and today's talk is going to be surprisingly about JavaFX UI Controls. So basically, legal disclaimer, don't believe anything I'm going to tell you today. My name's Jonathan Giles. I've been in Sun and Oracle for the last 3.5 years. I'm the team technical lead for the UI controls, like I said. I blog a lot at fxexperience.com and jonathangiles.net, and I'm a long-time client-side developer. Previously, I did a lot of Swing work. These days, I do a lot of JavaFX work. I've spoken about some of the open source projects I've done this week, some of which are DataFX and Scenic View, and I quite enjoy being an open source developer, and I hope you do too. It's a very rewarding career. As a hobby, that is, not as a paid job. You can contact me at jonathan.giles@oracle.com or on Twitter at jonathangiles. So the plan for today basically is to work through what a UI control is, how we can build UI controls. I've got a few worked examples that we'll work through. We're going to look ahead towards JavaFX 8. Today I kind of added in some hints and tips. I've been helping a few people here this week at DevOps on UI controls, and it's kind of refreshed my mind about what people sometimes have trouble with when building UI controls. So hopefully I can pass on some good tips to you guys today. And finally, I always like to do Q&A, so hopefully we'll race through these slides and have plenty of time for Q&A, and I'm always happy to kind of answer questions whether or not I know the answer. So how would you loosely define a UI control? And it's a lot more loose than you might think, for me anyway. All it really is a node, so something that goes inside the scene graph. It does not necessarily have to extend from control. Control is kind of going the whole hog. You don't have to go that far. It's not even necessarily really reusable. It's just something that you can use inside your organization to suit the needs of your company. Commonly it's styled using CSS just because it's such an easy way to make your control look nice. So the three approaches I'm going to work through today range from the simplest through to probably the best approach. And if you want to do a UI library, for example, what we do in the JavaFX team at Oracle, or what the JavaFXtras people do, you probably want to go to the third approach. And basically, they become a little bit more complex as you go along, but the core concepts are all the same. So I hope by the time we get to the end of these slides, you're kind of bored of me saying the same thing over and over again, because we try to be consistent throughout. So the first approach is basically taking the Caspian CSS file that we use for styling all the UI controls in the JavaFX UI controls team, and kind of understanding how the controls are styled and modifying that to suit your needs. So you can actually find it within the JavaFX RT jar file, and it's in the ComSun JavaFX Scene Control Skin Caspian package. And for those that don't know, here's the lib folder, so it's just my C drive, program files, Java, JDK folder. Here's a JavaFX RT file within there. You can just open it up in your favorite zip file browser. So it takes a while to get all the way into the right folder. And there it is, there's Caspian CSS there. So you can open that up and actually see how we style all the UI controls in the UI controls team. And once you know how we do it, you can change how we do it to suit your needs. So you can provide your own CSS styling and modify things like the shapes, the fills, the strokes. Basically, everything we can do can be changed, and there's a lot of power in the CSS engine. So here's a quick example for a demo application I wrote a few years ago now, and it's for an employee manager. And it's basically using standard CSS, basically just throwing the controls together to suit my requirements. And there's a few things I don't really like about the default look. And here's some of them. So going from the top right, everywhere in our UI we have square corners apart from buttons. So I'd like to kind of change the buttons to be square instead. If you look carefully, you can also see that the grey around the button is of a lighter color than elsewhere in the user interface. And also, down the bottom right, you can see the split pane divider. Kind of looks out of place. So you can see there's that bar with the 3 dots in the middle of the application. I just don't like the look of that. Also, the color behind the tab pane by default is just a gray. And it really should be a gradient, so we can make that change. And finally, you can see 2 vertical lines on either side of the split pane divider. And to me, they stand out, and so I'd like to get rid of them. So just a side-by-side of a before and an after. You can see now we've made the buttons square. We've given them a darker gray. We've gotten rid of the divider entirely, although still the functionality is there. We've just basically made it invisible. And we've also got rid of those vertical lines on either side. And finally, the gradient behind the tab pane. It's kind of more in keeping with the user interface. So just quickly, how do we do that? So stepping through each of these individually, we make the content area for the tabs just have borders on the right, the right, the bottom, and the left, and none at the top. So that's why you see the border width is 0, because that's for the top. Then the next bit of code basically is changing the color behind the tab. So you can see the FX body color is being used, and that's basically a gradient rather than what it was previously. So if you look in the CSS for Caspian, that previously would have been a dark gray, and here you can see it's instead more of the FX body color, which is kind of a predefined color, which is a nice gradient look. So the next thing I want to do is hide the border around the split pane. And there's a border going around the entire split pane, which is the table at the top and the charts at the bottom. And that's what brings in those vertical lines. So I'm basically making the insets be 0. We're hiding the divider by making the opacity 0. And we're just doing a little bit of tweaking for the padding to make it look a bit nicer. And finally, we're making the border color of the buttons a darker gray, and we're making the radius square, basically, rather than round. Now, I'm just going to stop for a second, guys, because I've realized that my slides are a slightly older version. So if you give me 2 seconds, we'll see if we can find the newer version. Unfortunately, I think they've just disappeared. So, oh well, sorry about that. We're slightly out of date, but no hassle. So the next thing we do is obviously we have to take all these CSS changes that we've created and put them into a CSS file, which we've called devox.css. We kind of get the string by finding it relative to the class, and then we call scene.getStyleSheets, and then we add that CSS reference to the scene. So that's all well and good if there's a control that very closely matches what you want to do. For example, what Jasper does when he does his demos is he takes, for example, the CheckBox control and totally changes it. So it's not just a tick, but an entire toggle switch that can move up and down and animates between them and all that kind of stuff. But if what you're wanting to do isn't just the functionality that we already offer, the next step up is to do the option 2 approach, which is basically to extend the layout container, put the nodes into it, and then lay them out and style them using CSS. So the upside of this approach is actually far simpler than the third approach. Downside of this approach is that it's slightly harder to reuse this kind of control. You need to do that line of code there. You need to actually have your users of your control add the style sheet into their application, which may be fine if your application is being used internally only and you don't really need to redistribute your controls. But otherwise, it could be a bit of a nuisance if you ask people, download my jar file, put in the class path, and add this style sheet to your application at runtime. So in short, this is the best approach if you just want to write applications, which most of us want to do, and you're not a UI controls library. So an example of this approach is this segmented button, and I apologize for the colors. A teammate of mine made them green, and I don't quite know why. So a segmented button is a control that's kind of a long line with curved corners at either end, and only one of the buttons can be pushed in at a time. So the first step is really to work out what layout container suits your needs. In this case, it's perfectly suited for an HBox. and HBox is just going to lay things out left to right. The next step is to work out what to put inside your layout container. In this case, toggle buttons are perfectly suited because we only want one of these buttons to be pushed in at a time. And then, of course, this is when you decide what your CSS styling is going to be. In this case, my colleague chose green gradients, and that's how we got that ugly picture. I apologize again. So how do we write that control? So the first thing to note is that the segmented button extends HBox. And in general practice, that's a bad approach because you're exposing API from HBox that's not really relevant to a segmented button. The spacing, you don't really want people to change the spacing of an HBox. But in the case where you just want to get your application written, this is the best way to go about things because you have to assume that your colleagues inside your company aren't really going to muck around with it. So there's one line here that I missed that was in my newer slides where you have to get the style class and add segmented button as a string. Oh, actually, sorry, it's right there. That was another slide, sorry. So you have to do that because if you don't do that, you can't access this through CSS. So it's very important to kind of give a style class to your controls. And then this is really kind of the code that kind of ensures that we have two rounded corners at either end of your segmented button, and all the buttons in the middle are nice and square. So you can see, first of all, we have to add the children to the HBox. So whenever the buttons change, for example, a user adds a button or takes out a button, update buttons is called. You can see that on the previous slide. The buttons listener there calls update buttons. And so we always have to update the children to make sure that we've got all the buttons in the HBox. The other very important thing is to start toggling the style class of each of the buttons. Because you can see here what this code basically says. If we're iterating through all the buttons and we're at the ith button, which is the last button in the list, and if we're also at the first button in the list, that little bit of code on the inside of the first condition, then we're the only button. So we do a special kind of rounded corners on all four sides of the segmented button. Otherwise, we must be at the last button. If we're at the 0th position, then we must be at the first button. Otherwise, we must be at one of the middle buttons. So what we're basically doing is giving different style classes based on the conditions that are required for our control. And by giving these different style classes, we can then access them using CSS, which you can see here. So first of all, we only care about styling segmented buttons. So you can see here there's .segmented button. More importantly, what we really want to do is style first button differently than last button, and that differently than the middle button. So you can see here, basically what we're doing is we're giving different radiuses to different parts of the control. And this is where that ugly green color comes in. And when it's selected, we get kind of that pushed in effect, which you can see on the first line, you can see that when the toggle button is selected, have that pushed in look. Another example of this approach is the ToggleSwitch, which is another control that my teammate wrote for Java 1. In this case, we extend region, and this control can either be on or off. So it's basically your classic iOS kind of control. And basically, it just says on or off, and you can drag the thumb between the two places. Or if you click, it kind of animates across. The way we do it is we actually draw out the entire control, just like that, but we just have a clip in place so you can only see the area that's inside the clipped region. And when the animation moves, the clip moves in the other direction to kind of always keep the middle area in view. So once again, and I told you I'm going to get boring because I want to drill this in. We extend the layout container, in this case region. And this is the bit that I told you I missed. Before this square rectangle, we actually do get style class .add ToggleSwitch, and otherwise we can't access it using CSS. Then all we do is we add the children of the ToggleSwitch, in this case the off label, the on label, and the slider, which is basically that thumb bit in the middle. Then we just basically start running our CSS, ToggleSwitch, on label, off label, and the on-off slider. And this is basically styling each of these little, you can see there we're styling the off label, the on label, the slider, just using CSS. The other approach is Well, actually, ToggleSwitch is basically a checkbox, like I said earlier on. You're more than welcome to do it that way. I wouldn't do that personally because, like I say at the bottom, a checkbox has a text label. And what does text mean in the context of on and off? Does text mean the on label or the off label? But if you wanted to do it this way, you'd write a ToggleSwitch skin that implements the skin interface. You'd add ToggleSwitch to the checkbox. So when you create your checkbox instance, you'll go checkbox get style class set ToggleSwitch. Sorry, there's a missing comma there. Quote marks. And then in your CSS, you'd basically switch what CSS is used for toggle switches by passing in the FX skin. The best approach is the option 3 approach, the best approach if you're writing a redistributable library like the JavaFX UI Controls team is, or if JFX is. If you're not in those kind of camps, then you're better off using the second approach. So this approach basically makes use of the API that we provide, the control class, the skin class, and behavior class. And so basically there's this separation, and I've got a slide about that shortly, but control is a node. In fact, in JavaFX 8, which I'll talk about shortly, control is a region. And control is where you have all your APIs. So it's only the only accessible part of your control. And control has a skin. So skin's responsible for laying out the control nodes. And skin has a behavior. So the behavior is responsible for dealing with the user interaction. Behavior is not public API. In fact, I intend to not even have a behavior class when we do make our final decisions on how to deal with behaviors. So this is our kind of API at the moment. We've got control and skin are public API, but the base implementation of skin, which we call skin base, is not public API, but everybody uses it. So soon we're going to break a lot of people. So the first step to create a custom control is basically, in this case, this range slider control that doesn't exist in JavaFX, but Prue and myself, my teammate and myself for Java 1 wrote the range slider control just quite quickly. So if you were just write a control from scratch, the way I recommend doing it is to first of all create a range slider skin, and that just extends skin base or implements the skin interface. Create a CSS file to match that, so in this case range slider CSS. Then in there you'd create a .range-slider section, and you'd specify the reference to the skin. So you'd have range slider saying, this is the skin I want. Then you create a class that extends from control, so in this case you'd create the range slider. You set the style class in there. So basically the control knows a style class, so it can look up in the CSS file to find the skin, which it can then load. And to tell the control, the range slider, what CSS file to find, you override the getUserAgent stylesheet class. And then the next step's kind of, so that's a kind of a common thing that you always should do when you make a control. Then you have to start adding the API into your range slider control and start implementing the skin to observe the properties inside the control and respond to user input, for example, mouse and keyboard. And when it does that, it needs to somehow call the behavior that then calls into the control to update the state. So one approach to doing this would be to take the slider control and extend it and have the range slider extend from control. And when Prue was wanting to do this for Java 1, I was quite against that approach because you end up with API that's quite confusing. Again, what does value, the slider has a value property, but what does a value mean when you've got low value and high value and no actual concept of value? Some people, when they have a range slider control extend from a slider control, say that the value actually represents the low value. But to me, that just kind of does my head, and I can't. It's just not clear enough. So the way we did it in the end was to copy the range slider. Copy the slider code into our range slider class, and just start ripping out the the value references and changing them into low value and high value references. And very quickly you can reuse a heap of the slider code for the skin behavior and even the API without having to write a lot of confusing code. Plus it's a really good kind of educational experience. So here's a screenshot of both the horizontal and vertical range sliders. In this case, we extend from control. So this is the third approach where we extend from control. We have a low value is at the bottom for a vertical, and on the left-hand side for a horizontal range slider. Then same with the high value at the other end. Once again, we set the style class using range slider, and you can see there at the bottom for the range slider control to know what CSS file to load, it has to kind of return a reference to range slider CSS. So the next step is to start creating the skin. So range slider skin extends from skin base. A warning, skin base is not final API. It's a currently private API, and it will change in JavaFX 8. I'm going to break it just despite JF extras and everyone else that uses it. But we've kind of got a plan for how we're going to do it. So if anyone's using it, feel free to email me and I'll tell you how it's going to change. But you can see here what we do at present inside our code is we create the skin base, and it has two generic types, one for the range slider and one for the range slider behavior. So you can see in the constructor we create a new range slider behavior, and that's kind of handling all the user interactions, so the mouse and the keyboard. And you can see down the bottom there, we're just creating the range slider behavior class definition there. The other important thing inside the skin, as per usual, is to get the style class for all the little parts that make up the range slider, the low thumb, the high thumb, the kind of blue bar in between them, and the range bar, and the track behind them. And we set the style class on all of these so that once again they can be accessed using CSS. So here's a little bit of CSS. And you can see we always use range slider first, and then we say the low thumb is a direct child of range slider, high thumb is a direct child of range slider, just to make the CSS a bit more performant. And then we start specifying the rules for how these should look, how they're rounded, they've got a bit of padding, the background color, those kind of things. Another example is the very famous rating control. It's been around forever. Basically, it's got a few properties, a rating property. So this rating control has a rating of 2. It's got 2 stars selected, and it's got a maximum of 5. So that's why there's 5 stars there. Once again, we have to return the user agent style sheet for that control. So it's just the rating.css. The skin extends from skin base. And what we say here is that that next line strong, we're going to use it in the CSS to refer to selected toggle buttons, the star that's been selected. So you can see we create a rating skin, and depending on whether the API has been set to be vertical or horizontal, we create either a V box or an H box just to lay out the rating stars. And then update ratings called when the API is changed or the user clicks on the star. So you can see here what we do is we strip the rating for all the toggles, so all the toggle buttons, and then if the index of that toggle button so as we go through we see the 0th star, the 1st star, the 2nd star, the 3rd star, and so on for however many stars there are. And we add the strong string to the style classes for any of the stars that are less than the rating, so that, or less than or equal to the rating, so that we get the stars be orange and glowing for the ones that are selected, and be kind of faded out for the ones that are not selected. So here's a little bit of CSS. Basically, we're using toggle buttons behind the scenes, so we're not doing anything out of the ordinary. We're not using anything that you wouldn't expect. We've basically got an H box or a V box with toggle buttons inside it that has background images set. So you have an unselected star, which is the grey star, and when it's unselected, and when it's strong, we use the selected star. And when it's hovered, we give it a little bit of a drop shadow just to kind of make it glow a little bit to make it clear that it's interactive. All right, we'll just do some worked examples. And I have to apologize, everyone. My slide deck's a little bit out of date, so it's throwing me off a bit. So let's just do the range slider. So you can see here, here's the low value, the high value, and you can kind of move the values up and down by dragging the thumb. And that's the vertical case. So what I was thinking I'll do, I'll show you all the demos now, and if we get to question time and people want to see any of the source code, I'm more than happy to work through it with you. So there's a toggle switch, so you can kind of drag it in the middle, or you can kind of animate it across. And like I said, behind the scenes, the whole thing's kind of there. It's just been clipped to the visible area. Brace yourselves, there's a green button coming, all right. Day, week, month, or year. So you can kind of see there's rounded edges on either side, and the inside is square and all jutted together. And here's the rating. You can see this is the hover effect I was mentioning. Okay. So looking ahead a little bit, there's a lot planned for future releases of JavaFX in my team, the UI Controls team. Some of them for the very next release, some of them for releases subsequent to that. So for example, we want to have an API that's fully public for creating UI controls. We want to support custom CSS styles, so we want to be able to support custom pseudo-class states, which is, for example, :hover, as well as custom properties, so that you can basically style your custom UI control using CSS. We already have some working support for right-to-left support, as well as component orientation, so we can flip things around for countries or for users that are more used to right to left rather than left to right. There's a huge amount of work to do on accessibility, so that people with disabilities that need screen readers or different input methods are all able to use JavaFX. Tree table view is a big control that second most highly rated control, or voted for control on our Jira. There's a whole bunch of charts improvements that we want to do. Heaps of features and tweaks to make. For JavaFX 8, we've already done a huge amount of performance work, so things are a lot faster. We got massive performance gains in JavaFX 8. And my bug list is massive, so I want to spend as much time fixing bugs as possible. I'm really keen to hear what everyone thinks. It's always funny when you go to a conference, because everyone says, I love JavaFX, but it's missing one thing. But everyone's one thing is different. So I kind of have to filter out and kind of aggregate what everyone votes for and hope that there's a kind of a clear winner for the next thing we should focus on. But we do listen to what you want. Vote for it on Jira, speak to people like me at conferences, and we'll definitely try to make sure that you can do what you need to do as soon as possible. And kind of on that note, one thing I started recently was the OpenJFX Sandbox repo, which is a repository that's publicly accessible, and it contains a whole bunch of controls that aren't in the official repository, but they're things that I've wanted to give out to the community for a very long time that are finally out there. Things like dialogues and the range slider, a tree table, those kind of things are sitting in the Sandbox repository now. So if people want to play with those things, great. I did have the URL at the end of the slide deck, but I don't think it'll be there anymore. So one of the changes, big changes that is on my list is to work towards a public API for custom UI controls. So in JavaFX 2.2, the way it is currently is control and the skin interface are public API, but the skin base implementation is private API. Despite that, everybody uses skin base, and we have to work towards coming up with a public API that does everything that needs to be done, but it's public rather than private. So over the next few releases, we'll be working towards this. It's not something that we're going to do straight away in 8, but certainly there are 2 things that we have already done, and one thing that I'm still kind of working towards for 8. So we'll talk about those quickly now. Anyone interested can go to RT21596. That's kind of the umbrella Jira issue for public API changes for UI controls. So change number 1 is that the skin-based class that everyone extends from is now in a different package, which basically means we've legitimized it. It's now public API, and we hope that people will kind of move across to that. Basically, you just need to change your package reference, your import statement, but API is going to change as well. So yeah, warning, it's going to change. I will break your code a few more times yet. Change number 2 is that skin base no longer extends from region. So for people kind of used to how skin base works, which is a few of you in the room I know, you've kind of got to change your thinking a little bit, because previously control was a parent and skin base was a region. So we had 2 nodes in the scene graph really for one thing. So that didn't really make sense. So skin base now is just extending from object, so it's not a node at all, and control extends from region. And so it's really the skin's job now to lay out the children of the control rather than the children of its own, of itself. So it kind of, conceptually, it makes more sense. It never really made sense to have the controller responsible for laying out itself, sorry, the skin responsible for laying out itself, and the control was really just deferring over to the skin. It was very expensive, and we're very aware of the cost of a node. And it may sound silly, but when you go to a Raspberry Pi, one of these low-powered embedded devices, every node does have a cost. And if you think of a table view, it can very easily have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of nodes as you scroll around. So if we can make control and skin one node rather than 2, a table view is losing potentially hundreds of nodes. So another big thing that we're working towards is a public API for CSS styling. So what this means is you can define your own pseudo-class states, which you can see on the first bullet point where it's the underlined foo. So that's a pseudo-class state. So you can say, for example, a very common one is hover. So when the mouse moves over a node, that pseudo-class state hover is true. So you can say, when this node's hovered, change the drop shadow or change the fill or whatever it is. So in this case, you're now going to be able to define your own pseudo-class states. The other big thing that you need other than pseudo-class states is support for custom properties. For example, if you've got your own custom control and you want a custom FX property that does something inside your code, you want that ability. And so basically to achieve this is actually simple in a way. There's just a bit of difficulty in exposing just the API we want to expose without bringing in a whole bunch of other API that we don't want to expose. So really the work is to remove some of the deprecated and impl underscore methods that we have currently. And we've got all these stylable property implementations. So if you've ever used JavaFX properties, you know that there's double property, Boolean property, and so on. Well, we've got stylable double property and stylable Boolean property, and all equivalent implementations that can be accessed through CSS. So, like I said, another thing is RTL support, or component orientation. So basically, in many regions in the world, they read right to left rather than left to right. So this is actually a screenshot from about a month ago that one of my teammates sent me, and I was actually pretty impressed. Very, very little code was actually required to basically mirror Ensemble. So if you're developing for those regions, we've got a very, very simple API to let you do that. And the nice thing is my teammate even made a New Zealand version for me. See, that's the only joke that stayed in my slide deck. I've got so many more in this afternoon, but they all, I don't know, someone got to it. Tree table view. This is something I spoke about the other day, and if you don't follow me on Twitter, one thing that we've actually done, yes, we've announced that it will be in JavaFX 8. It's what I'm actually actively developing at the moment. So if people aren't familiar with tree table view, philosophically it's either a tree with a table attached or it's a table with a tree attached. I'll let other people fight that battle. For me, it's a table with a tree indentation. And, it's surprisingly the second most voted request in our JavaFX Jira. Surprisingly for me, because I've never really used them in the product, but I'm more than happy to code one. It's a fun challenge. So this is actually the JavaFX implementation from about 6 weeks ago. It's changed a lot since then internally, but the concept's the same. You've got columns with indentation. And in fact, this is implementation of the tree table view, and I've provided the ability for it to just browse my file system. So it's just kind of dynamically shows the right content based on what folders I've expanded. And it takes a lot of work to go from a proof of concept hack that I had at Java 1 to what I have on my machine now. But we're very far along the path. And I presented on Monday, I think, how I went about building the tree table view control. So if anyone's got questions about that, I'm more than happy to either answer them today or point you to my slide deck. The main thing is it's definitely an 8. One of the other big things, like as I said before, was accessibility support. It's going to come in an 8.x release for Windows and Mac. And basically, the main point is we're just hooking into the operating system. One of the nice things about JavaFX, rather than what was done in previous UI toolkits, is that we're much more reliant on the operating system to do what it's good at, which is kind of hooking down into the the low-level code and out to devices for people that need screen readers and those kind of very important tools for them to have as much of an equal playing field as possible. Oh, good. Looks like my hints and tips survived. Don't modify the scene graph needlessly. So I've kind of switched over now to talking about when you get started building UI controls, there's a whole bunch of things that you're going to do wrong. So here's a few hints and tips to kind of give you better performance or not make the mistakes that everyone else makes. First one is don't modify the scene graph needlessly. It costs a certain amount of CPU time every time you modify the scene graph. So if you're toggling something to appear and disappear, it's better just to toggle the visibility instead. Of course, this is kind of dependent on the number of nodes that you're going to be hiding. So if you've got a huge number of nodes, take them out of the scene graph by all means. If it's just 1 or 2 nodes, just make them invisible, set the visible to false. Probably my favorite tip that I give people is this one. JavaFX, and yes, sorry, this is slightly outdated. JavaFX tries to run at 60 frames per second. It does so in most cases. But it's possible for you to get a lot of events coming at you. And it's really bad if for every event that you get sent, that you don't want to update the scene graph on every event, because if you get 1,000 events per one pulse, you're going to be updating the scene graph 1,000 times, even though you can only really update the screen maybe once or twice in that time. So you're doing a whole bunch of needless busy work, updating the visuals that will never ever be shown on screen. So it's better to basically, when the pulse happens, which is the layout mechanism we have inside JavaFX, once per pulse, just do all the updates in the user interface at once. And the best place to do that really is the layout children method. So the layout children method is called once per pulse. So I don't know if my code's, no, unfortunately, the code's not there. But, the best way is basically to have a flag. If the scene is dirty because an event's occurred or 1,000 events have occurred, do update the scene graph and then set that flag to false so it doesn't happen on every single layout. It just happens when an event has occurred. Some people post blog posts about how they've discovered the wonders of bindings and listeners and how their controls will be forever different because they're using them. And I've never used a binding I never used a binding inside my controls. And the way I always think about it is there's a cost to these things. You're asking to be informed when something happens. That's not free, and every notification, of course, isn't free. I use listeners a lot, but use them wisely. If you can have a listener that listens to multiple events, do that rather than have a listener for every single event. It's less work that has to happen behind the scenes. And we're aiming for 60 frames per second. The less work that you can do, the better. Unfortunately, my slides are all stuffed up, sorry. All right, so all UI controls are open source. My team's been developing in the open for, I don't know, 6, 8, 10, 12 months. Go and download all that source code and learn how we do it properly. There's a bunch of different controls. All the controls that we develop are out, apart from HTML editor, which is in a different repo, but soon will be open source as well. If you are really serious about JavaFX, I suggest you join the mailing list. It's kind of, you get a huge amount of heads up about everything we're doing because we do all our kind of decision making and discussion about API as much as we can out in the open. So if you want to know what's coming up in the 8 release, probably at the same time many of us engineers will learn, because we're different teams, obviously, so we don't all kind of decide everything as one big group. People post that mailing list all the time with what they're planning, what their API design is. And certainly if you want to influence an API, you do it before it's released, because once it's released, it's set in stone and it's not going to change. And I really do encourage people to kind of ask questions or post suggestions on why the API doesn't suit your needs, because API designers, API isn't designed in a vacuum. We don't know everything. We need people to tell us what we're not looking at. Certainly, if you're using JavaFX file bugs and the bug tracker that we use, which is at this URL, javafxjira.kenai.com, we really do appreciate you filing bugs on us, because we create a control and we kind of have to move on. We're not employed to sit around and kind of forever test our controls, and they sometimes do break, or we've got an oversight, or we just haven't thought of every single kind of permutation, and so we really do want the perfect controls, and we would love it if you could help us on that. For the JFXtras people, join JFXtras. For those that don't know JFXtras, it's basically a third-party UI controls library. So it's got a lot of cool controls, and it's always growing. There's always more being added. So there's things like calendars and spinners and date pickers, agendas, dialogues. So there's a lot in there. And so if anyone wants to write an application in JavaFX and they're frustrated by the lack of a control in the official JavaFX distribution, there's a likelihood that it might be in the JFXtras distribution ready for use. And once again, it's an open source project. Another good tip is kind of a plug for one of my open source projects, Scenic View. If you are doing any JavaFX development, I highly recommend you use Scenic View. And I've done 2 presentations already this week, so I'm not going to go on about it for too long. But basically, there's a tool that shows your application scene graph at runtime. So on the left-hand side, there's a tree that shows the structure of your application. And on the right-hand side, there's basically the properties for the selected node. So it really gives you a really good drill down into what your user interface is doing and where things are going wrong. There's an overview at the bottom. And it kind of lets you filter and search and kind of drill down into your application. It also gives these overlays for the layout bounds and bounds and parents, which is my favorite feature. It's what I've used all the time. It's a reason why I kind of wanted to open source Scenic View in the first place, because it's just really, really useful to know these things. So the layout bounds is that green dashed area, and the bounds and parent is that yellow filled rectangle. So it's kind of an overlay to kind of let you understand why things are different or what's going on. And slowly learn about the layout API as well as all the other API in JavaFX. There's a few good websites, fxexperience.com and javafxcommunity.com. Certainly, both very good at kind of capturing having the finger on the pulse of the JavaFX community. And that's it. Sorry about the kind of messed up slide deck, but hopefully it was informative. And I've left plenty of time for questions now. So if anyone has questions, I'm happy to stay here until we get kicked out to talk about. Yes. So the question is, can you create skins in fxml? And the answer is, I can't see why not. I probably wouldn't do it just because you have to parse in the fxml at runtime. So I would rather do it in Java code if possible. But I can't see why you couldn't do that. It might be a little bit heavy for the sake of a skin, but you can do that if you want. And just whilst I'm here, the next question that gets asked, so sorry, I've got a lovely Pro JavaFX book from Jim Weaver to give out. So if there's any other questions, get them in now. Well, all right, I'll ask the same guy again. Right. So congratulations, you've got a book. Come on down later on and I'll give it to you. The question was, can you manually trigger a layout? And the answer is yes. There's do layout methods and layout children. You can basically call them yourself. At present, there's not a public API to force a pulse, but we're working towards that. There's a private API. If you go toolkit, into the toolkit, there's a pulse method that basically forces a pulse to run. Tend not to try to use that because obviously needless pulses are expensive and they force a layout and a CSS run and all the bounds calculations to run again. So it's you don't want to do that if you can help it. I saw another question. Yes.
What about integration with builder tools like Maven?
So the question was, what about integration with builder tools like Maven? And the answer is, we're actively working towards a better build setup. Primarily, we're focusing on Gradle at the moment, kind of as a build script. There's a lot of discussion on the OpenJFX dev mailing list about Maven. Sun and Oracle, coming from Sun, being an Oracle person now, we've traditionally not been very wise about Maven as a means for building our toolkits. And there are people in the third party out in the open source communities. There's a lot of different Maven explorations for JavaFX. And there's a lot of discussion going on, even this week whilst I've been at DevOps, on Maven support for JavaFX. I'm not going to proclaim to be an expert on Maven because I'm one of those Sun Oracle employees that just doesn't know it, sorry. But soon we're going to be fully open source. So we're working towards being more inclusive and more part of the community as best we can. And one of those things I'm sure sooner or later will be how do we play better with Maven.
Do I still have to include the JavaFX runtime library in the class file?
No, as of Java 7 update something that's already come out, that's not necessary. In fact, when I browsed my file system earlier on, this is Java 7 update 7, and the JFX RT jar file is just kind of there in the file as part of Java. So moving forward, we're going to be bundled with, we are bundled with Java 7, and will continue to be so forevermore until they kick us out. Yes?
Developer control now, do you recommend using the private classes, the skin base and behavior base, or do you recommend using the public skin interface?
So the question was, do I recommend using skin base, the private code that's not public API, or should people use the public interfaces? And I don't see my boss in the room. So the answer is use the private APIs. Because everyone else is, you're going to learn the best that way because that's what we do internally, that's what JF Extras does. Just be aware that we will break you. I'm actively working towards breaking your code at the moment, and by the end of January, I should hopefully be roughly API complete for the changes for JavaFX 8, so you can start investigating how to move towards the new APIs middle of next year for JavaFX 8. But certainly use the private APIs now. Good thing this hasn't been recorded, right? All right, anything else? Yes?
Have you tried running Scenic View on itself?
Yes, sure. Yes, it works. Although what we did recently, well, let's try it. This may end in like a continuous loop that like sucks us into some black hole, but we'll try. I was going to say it used to be possible, but we added some code that would kind of make it so that Scenic View wouldn't see itself. So I suspect that we won't see it anymore. We could probably see it if we started up as a Java agent rather than trying to discover it at runtime. But no, it looks like it's not going to find itself. Because previously, when we added support for runtime discovery of applications, Scenic View was finding its own instance, which is kind of bad. So we kind of took that out. for those of you that don't know Scenic View, this. So all I did was start up Scenic View, well actually 2 instances. I shut down one, then I started up the range slider demo. And after a few seconds, Scenic View just found that running application. So what we can do now is we can start to click around. Oops, sorry, I'm running a very kind of, all kinds of beta software, so excuse the null point, or no such method exceptions. But you can see as I click around, I'm kind of discovering parts of my user interface. And we can drill in, for example, on the range slider to the number access, some labels, paths, text nodes. So very useful tool. You can kind of come into each one of these. So you can kind of see 75 is kind of highlighted up there on the Hello range slider. You can kind of come in and change these values. So let's change this, I don't know, 200. So we just kind of adjusted the scene graph at runtime, just to learn what happens when we do that. If we start to play around with the control, it's going to have its layout happen, so that's when it jumps back in. So it's a very useful tool. There's a whole bunch of stuff we can do in Scenic View. So if anyone's got any more Scenic View questions, I'm happy to work through that as well. We've got about 10 more minutes, roughly. Otherwise, we can all start lining up for James Bond. Okay. Well, oh.
Yes, talking about the Scenic View, does it take a lot of memory when you're running to your application and you start the Scenic View? Because in a few minutes, if you open both of them, your computer starts freezing. Do you have memory issues with that?
So the question is Scenic View causing memory problems? I would hope not. It's my software, so I would hope not. The problem is, certainly in the earlier releases, we weren't being smart. You know, one of the things I said earlier on is update once per pulse, and we weren't doing that. Now we are in 1.3. This is the latest release of Scenic View. So certainly try again with that. If it continues, let me know so we can make it better. Yes. So I used to think the answer was no. Now I believe the answer is you can include them, but it's not as complete as a normal UI control is. Certainly one of the things we're working towards in the future is having a means for you to kind of annotate, not necessarily with annotations, but describe the UI control such that it can be understood by Scene Builder. Scene Builder. It's not something we have now, but it's something we're definitely working towards. And it's one of those things that when I go to a conference, it's one of those requests I hear a lot. It kind of bubbles to the top. So, yeah, that's something we're definitely supporting. I don't quite know what we support presently, but I was told today that we actually do support it somewhat. Radio? No more questions? Well, thank you very much.